On January 18th, 2011, a young Egyptian activist named Asma Mahfouz stepped into Tahrir Square to start a revolution. She had done everything right. She was charismatic, well-connected, savvy about social media, had tens of thousands of followers on Facebook and Twitter. She was a seasoned organizer who had successfully mobilized people before. The Tunisian revolution had just succeeded weeks earlier. Everyone could feel that Egypt was ready. The country was primed. Mahfouz rallied her massive audience. She told them the time had come. She walked into the square, arm in arm with a small group of friends. Any guesses as to what happened next? Nobody else showed up. Nobody except the police. However, 7 days later, same square, same city, same political conditions, 50,000 people showed up and overthrew a government. What changed in 7 days? The message certainly didn't change. The messenger didn't even change. The grievances didn't change. What changed was the network. That's what this book is about. And if you run campaigns, build coalitions, if you try to move public opinion, the answer to that question matters a hell of a lot. So welcome to Masters of Public Affairs. I'm Joseph Lavoie. This is the show where we work the fundamentals of public affairs by going deep on books that matter most. And today's book is Change: How to Make Big Things Happen by Damon Centola. Centola is a sociologist and network scientist at the University of Pennsylvania. He runs the Network Dynamics Group, and he spent the better part of 2 decades studying a question that should keep every public affairs practitioner up at night. Why do some change efforts succeed while others, often better funded, better designed, and more urgent, fail completely? His answer overturns about a century of conventional wisdom. And when I first read this book, it upended the way I think about campaigns. It really did. Because here's a setup. For as long as we've had a theory of how things spread through populations, we've borrowed it from epidemiology. We've assumed behavior spread the way diseases do. Find the right carrier, maximize exposure, make the message sticky, and it'll go viral. This is the operating logic behind influencer marketing, media relations, broadcast campaigns, and most of the public affairs work being done right now. Centola, however, says that model works fine for spreading simple information. It does not work at all for spreading behavior change. And the distinction between those two things is where this entire book lives. Let me take you through it. Every good book is responding to a failure, and Centola is responding to a specific one: the belief that social change works like a virus. He opens the book with this: for nearly a century, scientists have believed that behavior spread just like viruses do. But as the world saw in 2020, the spread of human behavior, in fact, follows very different rules than the spread of diseases. Think about that for a second. We've spent a century modeling social change on the wrong science. And it's not a subtle error. It's a structural one. It affects where you put your resources, who you target, how you design your campaigns, and what you measure. Centola walks through example after example of this failure, and I'll give you 3 that hit close to home. First, Google Glass. Google had over 1 billion users worldwide, massive reach. They launched Glass with massive awareness. Everyone had heard about this new product, but the only people wearing it were Silicon Valley techies. And here's where Centola introduces what he calls the grapefruit problem: 2 ingredients that are useful on their own: awareness and differentiation, but lethal when combined. Everyone knew about Glass, and everyone could see that the people wearing it were different from them. Instead of aspiration, Google manufactured, as a result, resentment. The social norm turned against the product before it ever had a chance of taking off. For those of us who've run campaigns, that should sting a little bit, right? We spend enormous energy on awareness, but awareness without the right network structure just doesn't fail. It actively creates opposition to the idea. Second is a campaign called PrEP in Zimbabwe. This one's pretty tragic. PrEP is a daily pill that essentially eliminates HIV transmission. Free, easy to use, life-saving. The campaign followed the viral marketing playbook perfectly, right? Widespread outreach, early access, regular reminders, and it was, in Centola's words, shockingly ineffective. Villagers who told physicians they were taking the medication, had no traces of it in their bloodstream. They were actively lying about taking a drug that would save their lives. Why? Well, it's social stigma. If your neighbors saw you picking up the medication, they might suspect you had HIV. The social norms around HIV were so powerful that people chose potential death over potential rumor. No amount of information could overcome that. That failure wasn't in the message. It was in ignoring the social network that would interpret that message. Here's the third story, hybrid corn in Iowa. This is my favorite example in the book because it's the longest arc. So in the late 1920s, hybrid corn was developed. It was drought resistant, high yield, exactly what Iowa farmers desperately needed as the Dust Bowl approached. Millions of dollars were spent on marketing this product. Radio ads, door-to-door sales reps, pamphlets. And by 1933, after years of aggressive campaigning, adoption sat at 1%. 1% for a product people desperately needed that was free to try and that clearly worked better than what they had. And Centola explains why. When people are scared, they hold on to what they know. For farmers on the brink of bankruptcy, the worsening drought was a reason to stick with the established way of doing things rather than take a risk on an unknown product. And here's the kicker. The marketing itself backfired because marketers' efforts to spread new scientific evidence to counter the farmers' rumors served only to strengthen farmers' suspicions that something was amiss. Word of hybrid corn had achieved fantastic reach, but so had the rumors undermining it. And this is the failure the book is responding to. The viral model, the influencer playbook, the broadcast approach to social change, all of it assumes that the hard part is getting the word out. Centola says the hard part is something else entirely. So here's the core of Centola's idea, what he's effectively built his entire book around. It's this. Successful social change is not about information, it's about norms. Let me make sure that lands a little bit because it's easy to hear and it can be a little bit hard to absorb. And we're going to have a lot to absorb in this episode. There's a lot for us to get through. But information spreads through casual contact. One person tells another who tells another. Simple, fast. A virus. Centola calls this a simple contagion. News, gossip, memes, awareness, these are simple contagions. And one exposure is enough to infect you. You hear it, you know it, done. But behavior change, the kind of change we actually care about in public affairs, is a complex contagion. And complex contagions follow completely different rules. Here's Centola. Complex contagions are contagions that people resist. Some resistance to innovation is easy to understand, like Korean villagers' reluctance to adopt birth control because it challenged their cultural norms about family planning. Other times, resistance is harder to anticipate. In either case, contact with a single adopter is not enough. People need to receive reinforcements or social proof from multiple adopters to be convinced and for the new behavior to propagate. If we read that last line again, contact with a single adopter is not enough. If you absorb nothing else from this episode, absorb that because it means the entire game changes for us. The question is no longer, how do I get my message in front of more people? The question is, how do I create the conditions where people reinforce each other's willingness to act? That's a fundamentally different problem when you think about it, right? Because it requires a fundamentally different set of tools. So the core idea is simple. Information spreads through reach. Behavior spreads through reinforcement. And those two things require completely different network structures. Everything else in the book is an elaboration of that distinction. So if behavior doesn't spread like a virus, how does it spread? Well, Centola gives us the mechanics, and this is where the book gets, I think, very genuinely useful, because once you see the mechanism, you can start to design for it, right? And so the first big one is fireworks versus fishing nets. Centola uses two visual metaphors for network geometry that I think are brilliant. Weak tie networks look like fireworks. Each person is at the center of their own explosion, and their ties radiate outward randomly in every direction. Maximum reach, very little overlap. Your contacts don't know each other. This is the network structure that spreads information fast. It's the kind of the network that spreads a virus very fast. Strong tie networks look like a fishing net. Interlocking triangles and rectangles, high redundancy. So people are connected to each other's contacts. Information bounces around the same cluster before it moves to a new one. It's slow for spreading news, but watch what happens when you're trying to spread adoption. Centola ran what he calls the health buddy experiment. He built online health communities and connected people in either firework patterns or fishing net patterns, then introduced a new health technology to see which network would spread it faster. Although redundancy in the fishing nets was slowing down the spread of information, it was speeding up the spread of adoption. People who received reinforcing messages from several peers were much more likely to adopt the innovation. And here's the part that should make you rethink your entire approach to campaign design. In the fireworks networks, the early adopters, those who adopted the innovation after seeing a single message, typically used the technology once but never logged on again. In the fishing net network, people who required social confirmation from multiple health buddies in order to sign up, the so-called laggards, were significantly more likely afterward to keep logging on and using the technology. In fact, the laggards were more than 300 times as likely to keep using the health technology as the early adopters. 300 times more likely. The people we would traditionally dismiss as laggards, the slow adopters, the people who need to see it from 3 or 4 sources before they move, were the durable adopters. The early adopters who jumped in after one exposure, used it once, and disappeared. I want to sit with that for a second because it fundamentally challenges how we think about campaign success. We celebrate the early wins. We count the first wave of signups. We report the reach numbers, and we're probably measuring the wrong thing. The people who matter most are the ones who take longer to convert because they're the ones who stick. Now, let's talk about countervailing influences. This might be the single most useful concept in the book, and it's the one that's going to be the hardest to accept because it directly challenges what most of us do every day. Let me set this up with a scenario. So you're running a campaign. You've got a new policy position, a new tech, new coalition you're trying to build, and you're thinking about who to target first. Where do you spend your limited time and resources? The instinct, the one baked into every campaign playbook I've ever seen, including certainly many of the ones I've written, is to go after the most connected, most senior, most influential people you can reach, right? The CEO, the association president, the minister. The theory is simple. If you can convert someone at the top, their influences cascade downwards. They're connected to everyone, they're respected, their adoption sends a signal that this thing is legitimate. Centola says this instinct is not just wrong, it's completely backwards, and he explains why with a concept he calls countervailing influences. Here's the logic. Because it builds on something we've already covered. So remember, people are influenced by the percentage of their network doing something, not the absolute number. That's the finding from the Second Life study he ran. Adoption decisions are relative to the size of your social network. Now, think about what that means for a highly connected person. Centola asks us to imagine a prominent CEO, someone well-connected, socially perceptive, keenly aware of how their decisions will look to peers and clients. She got where she is in part by reading social signals accurately. You managed to get 5 early adopters of your innovation into her network. 5 people she knows who have signed on. That sounds like a decent start, right? But this CEO has 500 contacts. Those 5 adopters represent 1% of her social world. And what signal is the other 99% sending? Though her massive social network may connect her to a few people who have adopted the innovation, she is far more likely to know many more people who have not adopted it. I refer to these people as countervailing influences. The mere inaction of these people, their lack of adoption, sends a resounding message to the social star that the innovation has not yet been accepted. If we read that carefully, the inaction of the non-adopters is a signal. They're not actively opposing you. They're not arguing against your innovation. They're simply not doing it. And that silence, that visible non-adoption, is speaking louder than your 5 early adopters ever could. So it's saying that this hasn't caught on. This isn't a norm yet. Proceed with caution. Now compare that CEO with a mid-level manager who has 50 contacts. Those same 5 adopters represent 10% of his network. Same 5 people, but the social signal is 10 times stronger. And the countervailing influences, the people who haven't adopted, are proportionately weaker. The mid-level manager is far more likely to see the innovation as gaining traction and then take the appropriate leap. Centola quantified this in his Second Life study. Researchers tracked how a new social gesture spread through the platform and found that a person with about 500 contacts was roughly 10 times less likely to adopt than someone with 50 contacts. The most connected people weren't the easiest to convert, they were the hardest by a factor of 10. And it gets worse because the CEO isn't just passively receiving signals, she's sending them as well. When she doesn't adopt, her non-adoption becomes a countervailing influence for everyone connected to her. Her 500 contacts now see that this prominent, well-connected person has not signed on. That's a powerful signal in the other direction. The very person you're targeting to cascade influence downward is, by not adopting, cascading resistance downward. This is what happened to Asma Mahfouz in Tahrir Square, the story we started with at the very top of the episode. She was the influencer. She was connected, charismatic, trusted, but Centola explains why her influence didn't translate. Knowing that Mahfouz is a dedicated young activist also means knowing that she's different from most of us. Most of us have children, spouses, or elderly parents to think about, jobs to consider, or houses to protect. People could admire Mahfouz without feeling that her decision to march was relevant to their own calculus. She was willing to step into harm's way. Most people with families and businesses and reputations are not. Her bravery actually reinforced the distance between her and the broader population. She was an inspiring outlier, not a peer signal. So, what's the alternative? Centola's answer is the network periphery. The first step to seeing how change really works is to stop looking for the special people in the network and start looking for special places. The periphery is where people have smaller networks, 30, 40, 50 contacts instead of 500, where 5 early adopters represent a meaningful percentage of someone's social world rather than a rounding error. So where countervailing influences are weaker because there are simply fewer of them, and where adoption by one person creates a proportionately stronger signal for everyone around them. This is what happened 7 days after Mahfouz's failed rally. The network periphery activated. Ordinary Egyptians, people with ordinary-sized networks, ordinary jobs, ordinary concerns, saw other ordinary Egyptians showing up. The reinforcement signals were coming from people who faced the same risks and choices they did. And because these people's networks were smaller, the percentage of their contacts participating was much higher. The countervailing influences were weaker. The tipping dynamics could actually work. So for anyone running campaigns, and I'm talking directly to the practitioners listening to this today, the implication is uncomfortable but clear. Your instinct to target the most influential people first is likely creating the conditions for your own failure. Every highly connected person who doesn't adopt your position becomes a countervailing influence for hundreds of others. And the more prominent they are, the louder their non-adoption speaks. The better strategy is to build density in the periphery. Create the fishing net cluster. Let the social proof build among people whose networks are small enough for the signal to register. And then, only then, does the innovation start to look legitimate enough for the highly connected people to get on board. They'll be the last to adopt, not the first. And that's fine because by the time they do, the norm has already tipped. One more piece of the mechanism that matters enormously. Centola describes a study where researchers deployed bots on Twitter to spread positive messages. And they tested different strategies. And here's what they found. Sending repeated messages from a single source did not work. The crucial factor for the spread of these memes was not whether people received the same message multiple times, but whether they received the message from multiple sources. People who received reinforcing signals from the same bot were actually less likely to adopt the meme than people who received only one signal. This distinction is everything. Hearing the same thing 5 times from one source is not reinforcement. It's just straight up repetition. And repetition from a single source can actually decrease the likelihood of adoption. What works is hearing it from multiple independent sources. Different people, different contexts, all pointing in the same direction. So for those of us in this industry, this has direct implications for how we design grassroots campaigns, how we design stakeholder outreach and coalition strategies. Volume from one channel is not the same as convergence from multiple channels. Okay, we've been building the mechanics. Now let's sharpen this up into some models we can carry into our own work. Mental model number 1, narrow bridges versus wide bridges. Centola draws a distinction between two kinds of connections between groups. A narrow bridge is a single weak tie. One person in engineering who happens to know one person in sales, great for passing information, useless for spreading behavior change. A wide bridge is a cluster of overlapping ties between groups, multiple people connected through redundant relationships. Wide bridges provide the social reinforcement that complex contagions require. If your job is to spread awareness, narrow bridges are your friend. That's that fireworks cluster that we talked about earlier. Maximize reach. But if your job is to change what people do, to adopt a new technology, to join a coalition, to shift a policy change, to take action on your regulatory issue, you need wide bridges. You need redundancy. Most public affairs campaigns are designed for narrow bridges. And Centola is saying that for the work that matters most, we need a different architecture. Okay, so that was mental model number 1, narrow bridges versus wide bridges. Let's keep that in mind. Mental model number 2 is the 3 principles of relevance. Not all social reinforcement is created equal. Centola identifies 3 principles that govern when and why reinforcement works, and they depend on the type of resistance you're facing. Principle number 1, similarity creates credibility. When people need proof that something will work for them, they look to similar adopters, not aspirational ones, not prestigious ones, similar ones. He highlights a diet diary experiment in the book where adoption was 200% higher when the person recommending the tool had a similar fitness profile to the recipient. Less fit people respond to other less fit people, not to the fit role models you'd expect. He tells a great anecdote about attending a lecture by a world expert on obesity, and the lecturer is visibly thin, and the audience is full of young PhD researchers. And after the lecture, they all get together to network and catch up. And Centola writes the following: "I've never felt so defensive in my entire life. All I could think about was how skinny that lecturer was. We burst into a chorus of agreement. None of us could even remember the main points of the lecture. All we could think about was how offensive it was and how much we suddenly felt a craving for junk food." If these young health policy researchers can't absorb an obesity lecture from a thin expert, imagine what happens when we deploy spokespeople who don't match our target audiences. This isn't a messaging failure, it's a design failure because the source kills the signal. So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2 is that similarity creates solidarity. When change requires emotional energy and loyalty, joining a movement, enlisting in a cause, similarity among sources builds the excitement people need to act. Centola talks about the PALS battalion in World War I, which got men to enlist by promising that the people who signed up together from the same neighborhood would serve together. And solidarity was the mechanism, and it proved to be extremely effective. Principle number 3, diversity creates legitimacy. And this is where it flips a little bit. It's a principle most practitioners, I think, might miss. When the barrier to adoption isn't, will this work for me? But is this broadly accepted? When people need to believe a movement or innovation has mainstream legitimacy before they'll publicly support it, then diversity among early adopters is what matters, not similarly, diversity. The Human Rights Campaign's equal sign logo is an example of this that Centola points to in the book. In 2013, the HRC urged people to change their Facebook profile pictures to a red and pink equal sign to support same-sex marriage. Within a week, nearly 3 million people had adopted it. Researchers at Facebook studied how it spread and found something important. It wasn't the sheer number of contacts who adopted the logo that triggered someone to join. It was how many different parts of their social world those contacts came from. If you saw 10 friends from your activist community adopt this equal sign, it felt like a niche initiative. But if you saw from your cousin, a college roommate, a work colleague, and a neighbor, 10 contacts drawn from different segments of your life, the movement suddenly looked like it had broad legitimacy. 10 people, but from diverse social clusters, signal that this wasn't one group's cause, it was everyone's. Once that threshold had been triggered, users perceived there would be minimal social risks associated with showing their support. The same pattern showed up in political campaign contributions. Early donor diversity, not just donor volume, predicted whether candidates' fundraising would snowball. Strategies that focused too narrowly on mobilizing the base early could actually backfire by making the candidate look like a niche concern. So the framework here is that credibility problems require similarity. Solidarity problems require similarity. Legitimacy problems require diversity. So the mistake most of us might make is to default to similarity in every case. If the barrier is legitimacy, similarity can hurt you. It makes the change look narrow rather than mainstream. The discipline is diagnosing the resistance before you design the reinforcement. Okay, let's move on to mental model number 3. This one's a big one. It's the 25% tipping point. Centola takes on a question that has haunted social scientists for decades. Do tipping points for social change actually exist? And if they do, is there a number? Can you put a percentage on it? It's worth pausing to appreciate how ambitious this question is, because we all use the phrase tipping point loosely. We say an issue has reached a tipping point or a movement has tipped, but that's usually a retrospective storytelling. We look back and say, well, that's when it tipped. We don't have a way to predict that tipping point in advance. And a lot of serious researchers had concluded that tipping points in social systems might not exist at all, that the process is just too messy, too complex, too dependent on context to reduce to a number. Centola wasn't willing to accept that, and he had a theoretical basis for thinking there might be a precise number. So back in the 1970s, sociologist Rosabeth Moss Kantor had studied gender dynamics in organizations, specifically what happened when women reached a certain percentage of leadership roles. She found that when women held somewhere between 20% and 35% of leadership positions, the culture of the firm would dramatically shift. Below that range, discrimination and harassment persisted no matter what policies were in place. But cross that threshold, and the norms themselves began to change, not just the rules, but how people actually behaved. Kantor called it a tipping point, but she couldn't pin it down precisely. It was an ethnographic observation. It was not a controlled experiment. And so Centola wanted to build on her work and find the exact number. So here's what he did. He designed an experiment using 10 independent online communities, each with 20 to 30 people. And he connected the participants together into social networks and then had them play what amounts to a coordination game. Each community was given a photograph of a stranger's face, and participants were asked, what do you think this person's first name is? In each round, you'd be randomly paired with one other person in your community, and you both had 20 seconds to type a name. If you matched, you both got paid. If you didn't match, you both lost money. Then you'd be paired with someone new, and you would try again. So here's the important part. You could only see what your partner in the previous round had typed. You had no idea what names other people in the community were using. No population level data, no dashboard, just one interaction at a time, exactly like real life, where you learn from individual encounters and try to figure out the norm from there. So at first, it was total chaos. A community of 24 people might produce 60 different names in the early rounds. Nobody could coordinate, but every once in a while, 2 people would randomly match, say they both typed Mia. Having finally succeeded, both of them would try Mia again in the next round with their new partners. And if those new partners happen to be connected to each other in the network, they might both encounter Mia from different sources. Now you've got reinforcement. Now Mia starts spreading through the cluster of the network. Let me read a passage from the book. Centola writes, the more times Mia was reinforced in a community's network, the more likely it was that additional people would start trying it, and the likelier they were to succeed, all of which made it more likely that Mia would keep spreading until ultimately everyone was using Mia in every round. How long did it take? In groups of 24 people, a shared norm typically emerged in under 5 minutes, from total chaos to complete coordination in less time than it takes to make a coffee. That's the power of network reinforcement. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Once a norm took hold, it stuck. everyone had a financial incentive to keep using an established name round after round. Remember, they got paid for every time they matched with someone. Deviate and you lost money. Stick with the norm and you get paid. So no one had any reason to change. The norm was locked in. Now, enter the activists. The experiment's not done yet. Centola seeded each of the 10 communities with a group of secret participants, members of his research team, and their job was simple: overturn the established norm. If everyone had converged on Mia, the activists would start using Ingrid in every round with every partner, no matter what. And they were committed. They never budged from that name. The critical variable: each community got a different number of activists. The smallest group was 17% of the population. The largest was 31%. And there were a whole bunch of groups in between 17% and 31%. And Centola's prediction, based on his mathematical model of complex contagions, was that the tipping point would sit at exactly 25%. Below 25%, the activists failed. And not just barely, they just completely failed. Dozens of rounds of continuous activism had no effect on the larger population, even when the activists composed 21% of the group. They barely had any impact on the other players. People were following the established social norm as if the activists weren't there. No matter how loud the activists shouted, Ingrid, the Mia-loving majority, just ignored them. So let's think about what that means. At 21%, you have more than a fifth of the population persistently, relentlessly pushing a new behavior, round after round after round, and the majority doesn't flinch. It's as if those activists don't exist. If you ever run a campaign that felt like screaming into the void, I've had many of those, where you're doing all the right things. Your people are engaged, your message is on point, and nothing is moving, I think this might explain why. Now, watch what happens when Centola crosses the threshold. In Community 6, we increased the fraction of activists ever so slightly to 25%. And that did it. Tipping point. The Ingrid minority defeated the Mia majority. From 21% to 25%, a 4 percentage point increase, the difference between 10 activists and 14 in a group of about 50. At 21%, the norm was immovable. At 25%, the norm collapsed and was entirely replaced. And it wasn't just Community 6. In every community at or above 25%, so communities 6, 7, 8, and 9, and 10 in his experiment, the committed minority succeeded every single time. Centola writes, below the tipping point, even large increases in activism have no effect on the rest of the population. A jump from 10 to 20%, for example, has no significant impact. But even a small increase in activism that pushes the fraction above the tipping point, that affects everyone. This is why social change often looks abrupt from the outside, right? Years of invisible work, growing a committed minority from 5% to 10% to 15% to 20%, and nothing visibly changes. The commentators say that the campaign is failing, the funders get impatient, the team starts questioning the strategy, and then one more push from 22% to 25%, and the whole thing flips in what looks like an instant. But of course, it wasn't an instant. It was accumulating below the tipping point the whole time. The world just couldn't see it yet. So if you're running a campaign, this has serious implications, because if you're at 20% and you pull the plug, you were one push short of changing everything. If you're at 15% and you spread your resources thin, trying to reach 50% of the population, you've wasted those resources entirely. Concentration matters here. Clustering matters. Getting to 25% in the right network locations matters more than getting to 10% everywhere. And here's the tough part, right? The work that happens between a 0% and 24% will look to everyone watching like failure until it doesn't. So you need to have a strong stomach. You need to be able to persist through those early days. Okay, that was a big one. I know I spent a lot of time on the tipping point, but I think I think it's personally extremely fascinating, and it has me constantly rethinking about how I design my campaigns. How do we get to that tipping point? Okay, mental model number 4 is about designing the network, not just the message. And this is the overarching model, the one that contains, I think, all the others in it. And to explain it, I need to tell you about a problem Netflix had in 2005 that Centola writes about. So at the time, Netflix was, of course, a DVD rental service. This is well before streaming, and they recommended movies to customers based on previous rentals, and they were bad at it. Their recommendation engine called Cinematch couldn't keep up with changing content, and it couldn't keep up with evolving customer tastes. Engagement was dropping. People were getting bored. The business was in trouble. So Netflix did something a bit unusual for the time. They opened the problem to the world. They open sourced it a little bit. They published their data, tens of millions of anonymized customer ratings, and announced a public competition. If you can build an algorithm that beats Cinematch's recommendation by at least 10%, we'll give you $1 million. And it became known as the Netflix Prize, and it essentially launched the modern field of data science. Thousands of researchers competed, and it took 3 years before a team finally cracked it. And Centola looked at that competition and saw an opportunity, not to build a better recommendation engine, but to study something more fundamental. When smart people are working together on a hard problem, does the structure of the team's connections affect what they discover? So if we think about that for a second, we tend to assume that innovation comes from talent, right? Hire the smartest people, give them resources, and the best ideas will win out. And Centola wanted to test whether the network architecture between those smart people might matter more than the talent itself. So he and his graduate student built their own version of the Netflix Prize. They call it the Amberg Data Science Competition, and they recruited 180 skilled data scientists and divided them into 16 teams. Each team was given detailed sales data from Fortune 500 companies and asked to discover the best predictive model for explaining product success. What predicts shoe sales, beer sales, some combination of price, style, endorsements, or something nobody had thought of? There were over 15,000 possible solutions. The teams had 15 minutes. Real prize money was on the line, and it was designed to approximate what life is like on any research team working under pressure on a hard problem. So here's a twist. 8 teams were connected in a fireworks pattern. Everyone on the team could see, right, everyone else's best solutions as they discovered them. Maximum information flow, total transparency, while the other 8 teams were connected in a fishnet pattern. Each researcher could see only a few teammates' solutions. So to learn about a discovery from someone several steps away in the network, you'd have to wait for the idea to travel across the bridges person to person. Now, we know what conventional wisdom tells us, right? Conventional wisdom says that the fireworks teams should crush it. More information, faster flow of information. Everyone benefits from everyone else's discoveries immediately. No wasted effort, no wasted time. And at first, that's exactly what happened. The fireworks teams jumped ahead. Someone would find a good solution, it would spread to the whole team in minutes, and everyone would converge on that approach. Fast, efficient, and coordinated. The problem came next. Whereas each team's early discoveries were invariably good solutions, they were far from the best possible solution. And once everyone on the team had adopted a good solution strategy, their future explorations were all fairly similar to one another. Everyone started looking at the problem the same way. Innovation stopped. Okay, so good solutions spread so fast that they killed the exploration needed to find great solutions. Once the whole team converged on a promising approach, nobody was trying to find anything radically different. And why would you, right? Your teammates have all settled on something that works. Deviating from that feels very risky. But if you look at the fishing net teams, they were messier, slower to start. Different clusters were exploring different approaches in parallel, and it took time for discoveries to travel between them. It looked inefficient. But that slowness was doing something crucial. It was protecting intellectual diversity. While one cluster was pursuing one approach, another cluster was free to pursue something completely different without being pulled toward premature consensus. And some of those different approaches, the weird, the unlikely looking explorations that would have been abandoned immediately in a fireworks team, turned out to contain the breakthrough combinations that produced the best solutions. The hallmark of a well-designed team is that it preserves intellectual diversity while enabling coordination. Centola draws a historical parallel that's worth noting. Jared Diamond asked a version of this same question about civilizations. Why did Europe overtake China technologically when China had a massive head start? China's centralized information networks meant good ideas spread fast, which of course is an advantage early on. But the same centralization meant that a single emperor could halt innovation nationwide, and repeatedly did. Europe's fragmented political landscape was slower to spread ideas, but no single ruler could shut down independent discovery across the whole continent. The fragmentation preserved diversity, and diversity, over the long run, produced more innovation. The application for us is direct. When you're managing a campaign team, building a coalition, or designing a stakeholder engagement process, the instinct is always to maximize information flow, get everyone on the same page, align the messaging, coordinate tightly, weekly all hands, share dashboards, real-time updates. Centola says that for complex problems, the kind of problems we actually face in public affairs, that instinct leads to premature conversions. You end up with a good strategy instead of the best one. The team aligns fast on something plausible and stops exploring alternatives. The discipline is designing for the right amount of connection, not maximum, not minimum, just the right amount. Independent clusters doing deep work, connected by wide bridges that allow breakthroughs to spread once they're discovered, but with enough protection that people aren't pulled into groupthink before the exploration is done. That's tough. Jeff Bezos landed on a version of this instinctively with his 2-pizza rule. If a meeting requires more than 2 pizzas to feed the room, the group is too large. Smaller, less connected teams preserve the diversity you need to solve hard problems, and Centola gives us the science behind why that works. Okay, we've covered a lot. Let's get into now our common misunderstandings. And we've covered the influencer myth and the repetition trap already, but let me flag 3 more places where conventional wisdom directly contradicts what the evidence shows. Misunderstanding number 1 is that awareness equals progress. I think we know this one, right? Most campaigns measure awareness as a proxy for success. Centola shows, however, that awareness without the right network reinforcement can actually make things worse. Google Glass is the clearest example here. Massive awareness combined with social differentiation created backlash. Hybrid corn achieved nearly universal awareness among Iowa farmers and yet only got 1% adoption. Awareness is the simple contagion part of the problem, and adoption is the complex contagion part. Measuring the first tells you almost nothing about the second. Okay, let's talk about misunderstanding number 2, which is that more reach is always better. And this follows from the virus model, right? If change spreads through exposure, the more exposure is better. And if you cast a wider net, you're going to reach more people. Well, Centola shows the opposite. For complex contagions, too much reach too early creates countervailing influences. When the whole network hears about your innovation, but only a few people have adopted it, the signal is this thing hasn't caught on. The non-adoption of the majority drowns out the adoption of the few. What you want is a snowball strategy. You want to cluster early adopters in specific network locations because that'll outperform any shotgun approach. Misunderstanding number 3 is that the best ideas win. Centola opens the book with examples of inferior products that succeeded and superior products that failed, and he's blunt about why. Success in the marketplace often has less to do with the company's better products than with its better ways of using a network. The poison pill in corporate governance spread not because it was the best defense against hostile takeovers, but because it reached a tipping point with specific industry sectors where peer institutions could see each other adopting it. Hybrid corn didn't fail because it was a bad product. It was objectively superior. It failed because the network wasn't structured to support its adoption. For public affairs, this is both sobering and empowering. The quality of your policy, your argument, your evidence, it matters, but it's not the determining variable. The network through which that argument reaches decision makers is the determining variable. You can have the best case in the world, and if you deliver it through the wrong network structure, it won't land. I think that has serious implications when you think about some of the stuff that we've already covered about in previous episodes. We talked about pseudo environments. We talked about the impact of emotion over reason, the importance of storytelling. It's not just the importance of storytelling. It's the importance of storytelling through the right people, through the right network. And that really adds a whole other level of complexity to our work that I think I certainly didn't really appreciate until I read Centola's work. Okay, let's move on to modern applications. Let me pull this into the present. Easier to do with this book because it was written pretty recently compared to some of our other books. But let's look at this. Where does Centola's framework show up in the real world? We'll start with Black Lives Matter. So the book's most detailed modern case study is the evolution of Black Lives Matter. The hashtag was created in 2012 after Trayvon Martin's death. By June 2014, so a full 2 years later, it had been used only 48 times. After Eric Garner's death in July 2014, it spiked to about 600 tweets. Then it stalled again. The viral model would say that the hashtag wasn't catchy enough, it wasn't sticky enough, it needed better influencers to carry it. But that's not what happened. What happened was network infrastructure. So on August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. The first tweet about it came from a resident who happened to be walking by the crime scene. Not an activist, not a journalist, not a social star. Just someone with a personal Twitter account. And within hours, other regular residents of Ferguson were uploading posts from their personal accounts, reporting minute by minute on what was happening around them. The police responded with a militarized stance, and citizens responded in person and online. Here's what the data shows. Whenever social media activity translated into real-world activism, people actually marching in the streets, the messages driving it did not come from highly connected influencers. The greatest predictor of activism was coordinated online activity in the network periphery. Wide bridges were forming spontaneously between previously disconnected communities, parents, students, teachers, activists, business owners, creating a fishing net structure where people could reinforce each other's commitment. And then something remarkable happened with the narrative itself. Citizens and activists forged a coordinated counter-narrative alongside mainstream news. Through the overlapping networks, they successfully reframed the Ferguson protests. Mainstream media shifted from terms like mob to citizens and community. And the network didn't just mobilize people, it shaped the story completely. So by September, the hashtag had exploded. By 2019, it had been used 30 million times. And when George Floyd was killed in 2020, the expansive network of wide bridges that began forming in 2014 was ready to channel public outrage and transform it into first a national and then a global movement for change. The infrastructure was 6 years in the making. The visible explosion was weeks. So this is what tipping points look like from the outside, sudden. From the inside, it's years of wide bridges forming between communities, years of slow coordination building in the network periphery. And I think that is something we need to spend some time thinking about. We are often tasked in this line of work with getting very fast results. And we have to sometimes generate fast results while also building movements around some of our causes, some of our issues. Well, let's recognize that actually to build sustainable movements that are actually able to drive change, that sometimes takes a lot more time than we are prepared to concede at the outset. Now, let's move on to political polarization. So here's a question, of course, anyone in our line of work has asked at some point, which is that if you could just get people from both sides to sit down, look at the same facts and talk to each other, would that help? Would exposure to different perspectives reduce polarization? The intuitive answer, of course, is yes. More contact, more dialogue, more diverse viewpoints. That should pull people towards the center. This is the logic behind bipartisan roundtables, cross-party consultations, multi-stakeholder group convenings. Get people in the room together and they'll find common ground. It's not that simple. So Centola tested this directly, and the results are a little bit devastating, potentially hopeful, depends on how you want to look at it. So he started with a piece of data that should have been, frankly, uncontroversial, right? NASA's publicly available graph of global temperature trends. It's not opinion, it's just straight up data. It's a measurement. A graph with a clear trend line. And you look at it, you read the trend line, and you're supposed to estimate where the temperatures are heading. And there is a correct answer. Well, except there isn't, right? Not once politics enters the room. Centola found that Democrats and Republicans, looking at the identical NASA graph, produced wildly different interpretations. Not just different emphasis or different policy conclusions, different readings of what the graph physically showed. Polarization was distorting people's ability to perceive visual information. So he designed another experiment. He recruited 480 people, half Democrats, half Republicans, and divided them into 12 independent social networks of 40 people each. In every network, 20 Democrats and 20 Republicans were connected together in a fishing net pattern with wide bridges running across the partisan divide. The design was deliberate. This was a network structure that had worked for spreading complex contagions in his previous studies. So if anything could facilitate cross-party learning, this would be it. Each participant looked at the NASA graph, submitted their forecast for future temperature trends, and then could see the anonymous forecasts of the people they were connected to in the network. They could revise their answers based on what their contacts had submitted. And the idea was that seeing how others interpreted the same data would pull both sides toward greater accuracy. And Centola ran this 12 times, 12 independent networks, 480 people total. It failed in all 12 replications. Both Democrats and Republicans learned nothing. Nobody changed their interpretation. Nobody got more accurate. Polarization held firm. Wide bridges, fishing net patterns, anonymous peer exchange, none of it mattered. Now, if you stop the story here, the conclusion would be grim, right? Maybe polarization is just too deep. Maybe no network structure can overcome it. Some researchers had argued exactly that, but Centola noticed something. The interface the participants were using had small decorative graphics on the screen. A donkey and an elephant, the party mascots. They weren't labels. They weren't attached to any participant's identity. They were just design elements, eye-catching visuals that happen to be on the page. The kind of thing that a designer might add without really thinking twice about it. So Centola ran the experiment again. New participants, equally polarized, same NASA data, same network structures, same anonymous peer exchange, 12 new networks, 480 new people. Everything identical, except this time they removed the party graphics from the screen. Let me read from his book. He says, cross-party interactions in these networks not only improve the intelligence of the group, everyone's ability to read the graph properly, but also completely eliminated belief polarization. By the end of the study, the forecasts of both liberals and conservatives had become far more accurate than we had thought possible. Astonishingly, both groups reached nearly 90% accuracy. I want to make sure that the weight of that lands, right? So we're talking about the same kind of people, the same data, the same network architectures, the same anonymous interaction design. The only variable that changed was whether decorative party imagery appeared on screen. With the imagery, 12 replications, 0 learning, full polarization. Without the imagery, 12 replications, near complete accuracy, polarization eliminated on a cosmetic design choice, something most of us wouldn't even notice, determined whether 480 people could read a graph correctly. Centola's explanation goes back to what he calls network bias. Those little donkey and elephant graphics weren't just decorations. They were framing cues. They reminded participants at a level below conscious thought that they were in a partisan context. And once people were primed to think in terms of party identity, the network stopped working. Wide bridges became irrelevant. People weren't processing peer forecasts as useful information from fellow citizens looking at the same data. They were processing them as signals from the other team. Wide bridges across groups can facilitate learning and mutual understanding, but only when these interactions are framed in a way that makes diverse participants relevant to each other. If interactions are framed in a way that stirs feelings of political loyalty, even by introducing something as trivial as a graphic of a donkey and an elephant, it reduces people's ability to listen to diverse opinions and even to see the facts clearly. Let's think about the implications for any one of us designing cross-partisan processes. Every stakeholder convening, every multi-party consultation, every bipartisan working group, the framing of the interaction determines whether the network structure can do its work. If the room is set up in a way that activates partisan identity, seating arrangements that cluster by party, nameplates that include party affiliation, opening remarks that reference the partisan divide, even the visual design of the materials, you've potentially neutralized the entire exercise before it begins. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. The cues that trigger partisan framing can be incredibly subtle. The participants in Centola's study almost certainly didn't notice the donkey and elephant graphics. They wouldn't have reported those images as influencing their thinking. Nobody would, but the effect was absolute. From 0 learning to 90% accuracy, determined by something no one consciously registered. And Centola puts it bluntly, framing effects can have a bigger impact than the message itself on what people ultimately believe. And we know this, right? We had a whole episode, the last episode on Words at Work by Frank Luntz. For me, is very much an exercise and a discussion around framing. So framing effects can have a bigger impact than the message itself on what people ultimately believe. This is why, for me, framing matters so much in so much of the work I do. And this reframes the entire challenge of cross-partisan work. The problem isn't that people on different sides can't learn from each other. They can, right? We saw this. The 90% accuracy results prove that. The problem is that we keep designing interactions in ways that activate the very identities that prevent learning. The network architecture matters, but the framing of the interaction determines whether the architecture gets to do its job. Okay, let's talk about the dark mirror. Let's talk about China's 50-cent party. So think about what we've learned so far. Complex contagions, real behavior change, require specific conditions of spread. People need social reinforcement from multiple independent sources. They need to be able to read the social signals around them, to see that people like them are adopting, to sense that a norm is shifting. They need wide bridges forming between communities, and they need to reach a tipping point, roughly 25%, before the new norm can overtake the old one. Now, ask the reverse question. If you were a government that wanted to prevent a social norm from tipping, if you wanted to stop citizens from coordinating on collective action, what would you do? Well, you could censor, you could block the information, shut down the platforms, silence the voices. That's certainly the old playbook. It's one we found in Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, Pinochet's Chile, and it works, but it's expensive and it's visible, and it often backfires by creating martyrs. China found a different approach, one that maps precisely onto Centola's framework, but it runs it in reverse. So in 2013, a violent attack at a train station in the Xinjiang region of China triggered a wave of social media discussion. Citizens were sharing reports, expressing grievances, beginning to coordinate. And if you've been following along, you can see the early conditions for a complex contagion forming. People reinforcing each other's interpretation of events, wide bridges starting to form between communities, a shared sense of outrage building towards something that could tip. Here's what the Chinese government did. Tens of thousands of government-paid operatives, posing as regular citizens, flooded Chinese social media with posts. But not posts disputing the reports, not counter-arguments, not propaganda in the traditional sense. Instead, they posted about a local parade. They started heated debates about China's new economic development plans. They teased fellow users into sharing opinions about President Xi's recent speech. None of this had anything to do with the train station attacked. And that was the point. These were strategic non sequiturs. They were part of China's cleverly designed and massively deployed nationwide campaign for social control. Instead of using social media to combat views that disparage the regime or to debate the nature of the events that took place, Chinese government officers simply created sufficient amounts of random chatter on social media to distract citizens from their legitimate grievances. Now, let's connect this back to the mechanism. What does a complex contagion need to tip? Well, we know this, right? It needs reinforcement. People seeing other people take the same position from multiple independent sources. It needs coordination, the sense that enough people share your view that collective action is viable. And it needs mind reading, the ability to look at other people's behavior and infer their sincere beliefs. China's strategy attacks all three conditions simultaneously. The flood of irrelevant posts dilutes the reinforcement signal. If your feed is 60% chatter about parades and economic plans, the posts about the train station no longer feel like a converging consensus. They feel like one topic among many. The coordination signals weaken. But here is the most sophisticated part. The operatives don't just post distractions. They post on both sides of debates. They create fake accounts that argue with each other. They accuse real citizens of being government plants. They make an estimated 448 million posts per year, roughly one fake post for every 178 genuine ones. The effect is to destroy mind reading. And remember, think about how mind reading is important. We talked about in a previous episode, Sweden's H Day, the whole day when Sweden made the switch overnight from left-hand driving to right-hand driving on its roads. And yes, thankfully, there were no major serious deaths and any major issues, but there was a lot of havoc on those roads. And that's because people lost the ability to read the mind of the person coming in oncoming traffic. So the ability for us to read minds is very important when it comes to social norms. And China manufactures that same uncertainty deliberately. When you can't tell which posts are sincere and which are manufactured, you can't read the social signals. You need to know whether a norm is shifting. You can't tell if the people around you are genuinely outraged or whether they're performing, and you can't gauge whether you're approaching a tipping point or nowhere close. And then there's the final move, and it's the one that reveals how deeply this connects to Centola's framework. The Chinese government doesn't hide the program. They openly acknowledge it. They publicly praise their operatives for doing this work. Why would you advertise your own manipulation? Because the transparency is the weapon. Everyone knows that some posts are fake, but nobody can tell which ones. So sincerity itself becomes unreadable. The network is still there. People can still talk. Information still flows freely, but the conditions that complex contagions need, reinforcement from multiple trusted sources, coordination signals, the ability to read the social landscape, have been systematically poisoned by the regime in China. Unlike the tactics used in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, the strategy of China's 50-cent party is not to stop the flow of information. Rather, it is to control the way that information is received and interpreted. Their strategy is to permit the exchange of ideas while shaping the social norms that govern the value of those ideas. This is the part of the book I keep coming back to. Everything Centola teaches us about how to create social change, target the periphery, build wide bridges, cluster early adopters, create social reinforcement, push towards a tipping point, has a mirror image. Someone who understands these mechanisms can also use them to prevent change. Dilute the reinforcement, poison the coordination signals, destroy the conditions for mind reading, keep the commitment minority permanently below 25%. The theory of complex contagion is amoral, and I've talked about this in previous episodes. The job is on us as practitioners to apply the ethical lens. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Let's talk about the mastery lesson in this. So what does this book teach us about becoming excellent at our trade craft, excellent at public affairs? And I think it teaches one thing above all, and it's a discipline more than it is a tactic. The discipline is diagnosing the infrastructure before you design the campaign. Most of us start with the message. We spend weeks on framing, on language, on the pitch. Then we think about distribution. Who do we send it to? How do we get it in front of the right people? And we default to the same model every time. Find the most connected people, maximize reach, hope it goes viral. And of course, we know by now that Centola is saying this entire workflow is backwards. The first question isn't what's the message? The first question is what's the network? Who is connected to whom? Where are the clusters? Where are the wide bridges? Where are the countervailing influences? What kind of resistance will this change face? Credibility, legitimacy, coordination, stigma, and only after you've answered those questions do you design the intervention. This is really hard work. It is very, very hard. I'm still trying to figure out how to do this well, and I'm not so sure I've quite unlocked that key. So definitely, as you start deploying this model, if you start figuring this out, I'd love to hear it from you. Because mapping networks is unglamorous work. Building wide bridges takes time. Clustering early adopters in the right network locations requires patience. None of it produces the satisfying burst of a viral moment. But the viral moment, as we know now, is just a sugar high. The network is the durable investment. That's where we need to go spend a lot more time. And that requires patience. It requires a lot of time. And I'm not so sure many of us have it. There's an anecdote near the end of the book that I think it brings us all home. And Centola was hired by the Philadelphia 76ers to improve their scouting process. The Sixers wanted to know how to get better at identifying talent in the NBA draft, finding the undervalued players everyone else missed, avoiding the overhyped busts that everyone else chased. The traditional scouting model is hierarchical, right? Senior coaches dominate the conversation. Their assessments carry the most weight. Lower ranked coaches, the ones who spend the most time in the gym watching prospects run drills, often don't speak up. The hierarchy determines whose voice counts. So Centola redesigned this process. He built an app that connected the coaching staff in a fishing net network and turned scouting into a quiz game. After watching prospects run drills, each coach would log in and predict that player's three-point shooting score. They could see the anonymous prediction of the coaches they were connected to, revise their own answers, and submit a final prediction. They then compared that with actual results. And the design was egalitarian by structure. No one knew whose predictions was whose, and no one's title gave them extra weight. The network did all the work. Several things happened that Centola didn't expect. First, the coaches found it fun. They're competitive by nature, and the quiz format tapped into that. Second, the lower ranked coaches saw their input actually moving the group's answer towards better predictions. And so they could see their influence in real time. So for coaches who'd spent years feeling unheard in meetings, this was significant. As he wrote, there's a lot of tacit knowledge hidden in the network periphery, and an egalitarian network offered a new way to collect and use it. The result, better predictions across the board. A 10-minute quiz surfaced knowledge that hierarchical meetings had been burying. Management changed how they evaluated players based on what the network revealed. And Obama made the same point in a lecture Centola references near the end of the book. He describes cabinet meetings where senior officials would skim staff summaries and explain them. And he said, probably inaccurately, while the staffers who'd done the actual work sat silent at the room's edges. Obama's habit was to call on those periphery staffers directly because they held the details that mattered. The pattern is the same in both cases, right? The case of the 76ers and the case of the Obama story. The best information lives at the periphery, not at the center. The center is where authority lives. It's where conventional wisdom lives. It's where reach lives, maybe, but the periphery is where the real work happens and where change starts. And the discipline of mastery public affairs, a thing that separates the excellent from the competent, is building the infrastructure that lets the periphery be heard before the center decides. Okay, let me bring it back to where we started. Asma Mahfouz walked into Tahrir Square on January 18th with everything the viral model says you need: reach, charisma, credibility, a massive audience, and nobody showed up. 7 days later, the network periphery activated. Ordinary Egyptians saw other ordinary Egyptians showing up. The reinforcement wasn't coming from a social star. It was coming from neighbors, coworkers, family members, people who face the same risks and the same choices. Wide bridges formed between communities. Coordination emerged, and 50,000 people showed up to overthrow a government. The message was the same both times. The network was different. Centola put it plainly: successful social change is not about information. It's about norms. Social networks are not about merely the pipes through which ideas and behaviors flow from person to person. They are also the prisms that determine how we see those behaviors and interpret those ideas. If you carry one thing out of this episode, carry this: the network is the campaign. The message matters. The messenger matters. But the structure through which the message reaches people, the pattern of connections, the width of the bridges, the clustering of early adopters, the presence or absence of reinforcement from multiple independent sources, that structure determines whether your change effort succeeds or fails. Everything else is secondary. This is a fundamentals book, and it belongs in the canon. And so thank you so much for listening. I'm Joseph Lavoie. This is Masters in Public Affairs. If you haven't yet, please do give me a follow. You'll find us on YouTube. You'll find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on Substack. You'll find us at mastersinpublicaffairs.com. Okay, we'll talk soon.